London, in 1600, was already one of the largest cities in Europe. But it was a city in transition. At the beginning of the 17th century, London had a population of around 200,000 people. By the end of the century, that number had surged to over 500,000, making London one of the fastest-growing cities in the Western world. This explosive growth transformed London into a crowded, chaotic, and rapidly expanding metropolis along the River Thames. Narrow streets overflowed with people, carts, animals, and refuse. Open sewers, smoke, and waste filled the air, while outbreaks of plague remained a constant threat to daily life. Although London had moved beyond the medieval era, much of the city was still shaped by late medieval wooden buildings, cramped layouts, and inherited infrastructure that struggled to contain its swelling population. Trade, migration, and imperial ambition were pulling the city forward faster than its streets could adapt. London in the 1600s was dangerous, dirty, and alive with energy. It was a city where wealth and poverty existed side by side, where global trade passed through ancient streets, and where history was being reshaped year by year. In this video, we use modern AI reconstruction to bring that world back to life, to move through its streets, cross its bridges, and witness London as it once stood not imagined, but reconstructed. As London expanded at a relentless pace through the 17th century, one structure became absolutely central to its survival and growth: Old London Bridge. Spanning the River Thames, the bridge linked the City of London on the north bank with Southwark to the south. For centuries, this was the only permanent crossing of the Thames in central London, making it impossible to bypass. Anyone moving goods, livestock, carts, or people between north and south had to pass through this narrow choke point. Construction of Old London Bridge began in 1176, commissioned by King Henry II, and was completed in 1209 under the supervision of Peter of Colechurch, a priest and master builder. Built of stone and resting on 19 narrow arches, the bridge was an engineering marvel for its time. But those arches severely restricted the river's tidal flow, creating dangerous currents beneath. Passing through the bridge by boat was so risky that boatmen coined the phrase "shooting the bridge" to describe the peril. During particularly severe winters, the Thames itself could become an extension of the bridge's strange world. The restricted tidal flow caused by the bridge's narrow arches sometimes contributed to the river freezing solid. On these rare occasions, Londoners gathered on the ice below, setting up stalls, fires, and even temporary entertainments during what became known as frost fairs. For a brief moment, the river transformed from a deadly barrier into a frozen public square. By the early 1600s, the bridge had evolved into something far more than infrastructure. It was a dense, living street suspended over water. Houses, shops, warehouses, chapels, and gatehouses lined both sides, some rising 6 or 7 stories high and jutting out over the roadway. An estimated 500 to 600 people lived directly on the bridge, while thousands more passed through it daily. Commerce thrived in this cramped space. Bakers, cloth merchants, goldsmiths, and traders operated shops at street level, while families lived above the noise, filth, and constant movement. With London's population surging toward 500,000 by the late 17th century, congestion on the bridge became legendary. Fires were a constant threat, sanitation was almost non-existent, and sunlight barely reached the street below the overhanging buildings. The bridge was also a symbol of authority. At its southern gate, the severed heads of traitors were displayed on spikes, greeting travelers entering the city, a stark reminder of royal power and punishment. Despite its dangers and inefficiencies, Old London Bridge remained indispensable until the 18th century. By the mid-1700s, its structure had deteriorated badly, and the buildings worsened traffic and safety. Between 1756 and 1762, the houses were finally demolished, and in 1831, the medieval bridge was replaced entirely by a new structure better suited to a modern city. For over 600 years, Old London Bridge was not just crossed, it was lived on, worked on, feared, and depended upon, standing at the heart of a city racing toward the modern age. By the early 17th century, London was not only growing in size, it was growing in power. Across the city stood a small number of landmarks that defined authority, belief, and control. Among them, 3 places shaped everyday life more than any others: St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower of London, and the Palace of Westminster. Each represented a different pillar of English society. Before the Great Fire of 1666, St. Paul's Cathedral looked nothing like the domed landmark we know today. It was a vast medieval structure, darkened by centuries of smoke and weather. Its long nave was not only a place of worship, it was a social space. Merchants met beneath its roof. Booksellers lined the churchyard with pamphlets, sermons, and political tracts. News, rumors, and ideas spread here long before newspapers became common. In the 17th century, religious tension ran deep. Protestant reform, Catholic fear, and radical preaching all collided in and around St. Paul's. The cathedral stood at the center of a city drifting steadily toward civil war. Downriver, the Tower of London cast a very different presence. By the 1600s, the tower was no longer a royal residence. It had become a fortress, an armory, and one of the most feared prisons in England. Accused traitors passed through its gates. Executions followed whispers of treason. Yet inside its walls were also stored the crown jewels, symbols of divine monarchy and royal legitimacy. To Londoners, the tower was both a warning and a reassurance. The state was watching, and it was powerful. West of the city, along the Thames, stood Westminster. Here lay the Palace of Westminster, home to Parliament. Beside it rose Westminster Abbey, the sacred site of coronations and royal burials. In the early 17th century, conflict brewed within these walls. Kings ruled by divine right. Parliament demanded limits. Debates held here would soon reshape England forever. By the 1640s, the struggle between Crown and Parliament erupted into civil war. Westminster was no longer just the seat of power. It was the battlefield of ideas. Stretching along the Thames just north of Westminster stood Whitehall, the sprawling heart of the Stuart monarchy. Rather than a single fortress, it was a vast, labyrinthine complex of over 1,000 rooms, halls, chapels, and private chambers where the daily machinery of government operated. Kings arrived by royal barge at its river steps, bypassing the crowded streets of the city. Behind these walls, royal decrees were signed and the fate of the kingdom was decided. In the early 1600s, Whitehall was the living center of royal authority, where power flowed directly from the river into the heart of the court long before fire would claim almost everything but its memory. Together, these places defined London's identity. Faith, fear, and governance stood within a few miles of one another, and through them, the city became more than a trading hub. It became the center of a nation on the edge of transformation. In the mid-17th century, London faced an enemy more relentless than war or famine. The Great Plague returned repeatedly, reaching its deadliest peak in 1665. Crowded streets, open sewers, wooden housing, and rats thriving in narrow alleys turned the city into fertile ground for disease. Entire households were sealed behind painted red crosses. Bells tolled endlessly for the dead. By the end of the outbreak, more than 100,000 Londoners had perished, nearly a quarter of the city's population. London survived, but it emerged traumatized, fearful, and weakened. 1 year later, catastrophe struck again. In September 1666, a small fire broke out in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane. Fueled by dry timber, strong winds, and densely packed medieval buildings, the flames spread uncontrollably. For 4 days, London burned. Streets collapsed into firestorms. Old St. Paul's Cathedral was reduced to ruins. Entire districts vanished. By the time the fire was extinguished, more than 13,000 houses and most of the medieval city lay in ashes. Yet in destruction, some saw grim renewal. A long-debated theory suggests that the fire may have helped end the plague by destroying the rat-infested wooden slums where fleas thrived. The city had been scarred, but it had also been brutally cleansed. What followed was one of the most ambitious urban rebuilds in European history. London would not be reconstructed as it had been. Wood was replaced with brick and stone. Overhanging medieval houses were banned. Streets were widened. Fire regulations became law. At the center of this transformation stood Christopher Wren, whose vision reshaped the skyline. His masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral, rose in Baroque grandeur, crowned by a vast dome that symbolized resilience, authority, and renewal. London was no longer a medieval city that had survived by habit. It was becoming a modern capital by design. While fire and disease reshaped the city physically, politics tore at it from within. Tensions between Crown and Parliament exploded into the English Civil War in the 1640s. London became Parliament's stronghold, its streets filled with soldiers, sermons, and radical pamphlets. King Charles was executed in 1649, an event that stunned Europe. For a brief time, England became a republic. Though the monarchy was restored in 1660, the balance of power had changed forever. Authority would no longer rest solely with the crown. London had become the stage upon which the modern British state was forged. By the end of the 17th century, London was unrecognizable from its medieval past. It had endured plague, fire, civil war, and political revolution, each crisis pushing the city to the edge of collapse. Yet London did not break. It changed. From repeated disaster came reform. From loss came order. The city emerged larger, more resilient, and more deliberate in its design and purpose. What had once grown by habit now evolved through planning. London also became more organized and more confident. Its port expanded. Financial institutions grew in scale and influence. Trade networks stretched across the Atlantic and deep into Asia. Most importantly, the 17th century forged London's role as a national center. Political authority, commerce, religion, and information increasingly converged within the city. What had once been a medieval capital became the engine of a rising power. The hardships of the 17th century forced England to adapt or fail. It adapted. The London that entered the 18th century was disciplined, ambitious, and outward-looking. Those qualities would shape Britain's rise in the centuries that followed. London did not merely survive the 17th century. It was remade by it.